The Empress Maria Theresa is the first female ruler of the great House of Habsburg. Maria Theresa was the eldest daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI and Elizabeth of Brunswick. Maria Theresa was born on May 13, 1717. The death of his only son prompted Charles VI, Charles VI, the only living prince in his line, therefore he had no brothers, to promulgate what would be called as the Pragmatic Sanction. This royal act, which was eventually recognized by most powers in Europe, this gave a female the ability to inherit the domains of the Habsburgs. In 1720, Charles worked tirelessly to earn support for the sanction from his crown lands and several of the great European powers. Over time, they begrudgingly agreed to honor the sanction. Maria Theresa's education and upbringing were typical of a young princess at the time. Her studies focused on frivolous skills thought to befit a young noblewoman. Despite the fact that Maria Theresa, who indeed still did not have any brothers, was increasingly likely to inherit the Habsburg throne, she was ill acquainted with the affairs of state. In 1736, she married Francis Stephen of Lorraine. Because of French objections to the union of Lorraine with the Habsburg lands, Francis Stephen had to exchange his ancestral duchy for the right of succession to the Grand Duchy of Tuscany. The marriage was a love match, and eventually there would be 16 children born to the couple, only 10 of whom would survive to adulthood. On October 20th, 1740, Charles VI died. In the War of Succession he had striven so hard to prevent broke out before the end of the year. The Habsburgs held control over the Holy Roman Emperor position since the 1400s, but only males could hold that position. So, the House of Habsburg promoted hard her husband, Francis I, to the position of Holy Roman Emperor. Maria Theresa had hoped to keep control of the Habsburg lands, and the Pragmatic Sanction had given her the right to do this. But her husband was not able to hold on to the throne of the Holy Roman Empire, at least not originally. This position went to Charles Albert of Bavaria. The major challenge to the Habsburg authority, came from, of course, Frederick the Great of Prussia, who invaded Silesia. As Maria Theresa wrote of this time in her life, "In these circumstances, I find myself without money, without credit, without an army, without experience or knowledge, and finally, without advice, because every consular wanted to wait and see what would happen. Such were the conditions when the King of Prussia invaded my kingdom. This monarch's sweet words and vigorous promises convinced each of my ministers that he would avoid opening hostilities. Plus, my own inexperience and good faith is why such defensive preparations were not made in Silesia." Of course, we know how this would ended. With the death of Charles Albert of Bavaria in early 1745. His son, of course, did not have any ambition to hold the throne, and therefore would acknowledge Francis I as the new Holy Roman Emperor. Of course, Frederick, though, would be successful in holding on to the Duchy of Silesia, at least for now. In the face of opposition of many noblemen, she managed to drastically reduce, with the exception of Hungary, of course, the powers of the various dominions and states. In the further process of abolishing tax exemptions held by the great landowners who dominated those assemblies, she hit on the notion of God-pleasing equality. Yet she did not question the justice of the manorial lord's claims on the labor of his hereditary subjects. Only many years later did the peasant riots in famine-stricken Bohemia and the reported cruelty of Hungarian magnates cause her to limit the use of forced labor. The peasantry must be able to sustain itself, as well as pay taxes, she would write. Most of the reforms carried out under Maria Theresa's reign were done without any true ideological fervor. This, of course, unlike Frederick of Prussia, who was very idealistic, but simply to gain as much of an effect as it could on the state's military and economic situation. Maria Theresa, even for her time, had a very conservative understanding of monarch rule, seeing herself as being entrusted with the office as ruler by divine right. Thus it was to God, not to her people, that she had to justify her actions. She was guided not by reason, belief in progress and tolerance, or the principles of just rule as demanded by the Enlightenment, but strove to fulfill the task which she had been entrusted by the divine providence according to the best of her knowledge and belief. Maria Theresa's pre-modern cast of mind manifested itself in her religious understanding. She remained a pre-Enlightenment Catholic throughout her life. This resulted in continued intolerance towards non-Catholics in the Habsburg lands. Under Maria Theresa's rule, Protestants continued to be persecuted, and an inglorious climax which was reached when the Jews, and also another persecuted group under the Habsburgs, were expelled from Prague in 1744. The largest Jewish community at that time in the monarchy was dissolved, and 20,000 individuals had to leave the city within a short time. In the 1750s, Maria Theresa exiled Protestants from Austria to Transylvania, including 2,600 from Upper Austria. And her son, who would eventually become co-ruler, Joseph, regarded his mother's religious policies as unjust, impious, impossible, harmful, and ridiculous. This would just sum up her understanding of the affairs of state. Thus, although Maria Theresa was convinced of the necessity of unifying the various legal traditions of the crown lands and placed the judicial system under the supervision of a supreme judicial office, the separation of the judiciary and executive authorities as demanded by the representatives of the Enlightenment was not realized. Today in Austria, Maria Theresa gave birth to 16 children in her lifetime. Her successor, Joseph II, her oldest son, who would finally restore the Habsburg title to the Holy Roman Emperorship. I won't bother naming all of her 16 offspring, but perhaps her most famous child is the eventual Queen of France and the child of the French Revolution, Maria Antoinette, who of course was killed in the violence. The diplomatic revolution is of course what made Marie Antoinette's marriage to the son of Louis XVI possible. The diplomatic revolution brought a large European coalition in an attempt to dislodge the King of Prussia. Though it would of course not be successful, Maria Theresa was after the war, Maria Theresa was forced to share the throne with her son in 1777, making him co-ruler. Though she opposed the British in the 7 Years' War, the Habsburgs stayed largely neutral during the American Revolutionary War, without not choosing either side. Maria Theresa died in 1780 and left a massive legacy as the only female ruler in the history of the great Habsburg dynasty.